right, good evening everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Tolkien Lecture on Fantasy Literature. Since 2013, this lecture series has been organized by a committee of students and alumni of Pembroke College in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien and the enormous contribution to fantasy literature that he made whilst serving as the Rowlandson Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon here from 1925 to 1945. This lecture is held annually thanks to the generous support of the Pembroke Pink Grant Scheme and the Cottas Foundation, and of course, the support of the lecture attendees over the past 13 years. Special thanks also goes out to the Tolkien family and estate for encouraging our exploration of fantasy literature through these lectures. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from a writer whose work continues to reshape and enrich the landscape of speculative fiction, Zen Cho. Zen is the internationally acclaimed author of Sorcerer to the Crown, The True Queen, and Blackwater Sister, as well as numerous short stories. Her writing is renowned for its wit, nuance, and originality, seamlessly blending history, magic, and postcolonial insight with a vibrant sense of humanity. She is the winner of the Hugo, Crawford, and British Fantasy Awards, and she has become a vital voice in the contemporary fantasy canon. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Zen Cho, who will deliver her lecture, The Uses of Fantasy.
Thank you, Annika. So that was the worst moment for me. It might get worse for you, but it's not going to get worse for me now. Right. So it's a daunting thing to be asked to give a named lecture. So my first priority is to manage your expectations. The good news is I have done a fair amount of public speaking in the course of my 2 jobs. I'm also a lawyer in my abundant free time. The bad news is the last time I delivered a talk to a large audience, it was on the subject of the entry into force of Regulation EU 2023/988 of the European Parliament and of the Council of 10th May 2023 on general product safety. So aren't you glad you came today? You'll be relieved to hear that I'm not planning to tell you about product safety regulation, interesting as it is. Today I'm going to talk about the uses of fantasy. So what do I mean by the uses of fantasy? When speaking about fantasy, it's easy to lapse into defensiveness. And I found this when I started drafting this lecture, right? Because it's been so often dismissed, you come armed with arguments for its seriousness, like Ursula Le Guin's famous paraphrase of Tolkien's defense. Yes, he, that's Tolkien, said fantasy is escapist and that is its glory. If a soldier is imprisoned by the enemy, don't we consider it his duty to escape? As a fantasy writer, you feel the need to defend yourself, and not only against serious literature, but fantasy's own sister, science fiction. I was invited to a fairly rarefied summit once all about Asia and technology and the future, and the theme was artificial intelligence. And I knew exactly why I was there, right? So when I was asked about the summit's topic, I was put on the panel, I said, look, I know I'm here because I'm Chinese, and China is a rising superpower, and you think I'm writing about the future and technology and useful things like science. Now you're about to find out I'm actually Malaysian, not a rising superpower, and I write about the past, and I'm obsessed with dead people. But I'm assuming if you're here today, you have some sympathy with my interest in those topics. I don't have to sell fantasy literature to you. You already agree it's worth your time. So by the uses of fantasy that I want to talk about, I mean its uses for someone like me, a writer. I'm not that interested in the utilitarian sort of approach to literature that's only interested in asking what it does for the real world. I think it's a big assumption that the physical realm or society is the only real world. Right? We all carry worlds inside us which are arguably as important. The insides of our heads are where we live. So what does fantasy do for your interior world? I find it's a good place to work things out. It allows you to look at things aslant. I remember as a child being very struck by a couple of lines in C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, and they go like this. What you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. This idea that your perception and therefore your own individual reality may differ from others was new to me, but at the same time, I instantly felt it was true. I just had never seen it articulated before, which is one of the great things literature can do, right? You can switch the line around and it still works. What sort of person you are depends a great deal on where you are standing. And if you change where you're standing, that changes what you can see and hear. And that's what fantasy gives you. Narnia is a great example. So the Pevensey children, they fall out of World War II England into this magical world where they reign as kings and queens. Presumably, they have plenty of time during their reign to develop systems of good governance, design policies for the flourishing of all Narnians. Then they come home again to the ordinary world, returning to childhood. And that's what fantasy can do for you. You can travel to another place, another time. You can design whole worlds, societies, possibilities. Then you can come back to yourself again and assume your own opinions. Now, don't get me wrong. You can do this with any kind of fiction. But the advantage of fantasy is that you're not constrained by the laws of physics. Fantasyland is ruled by the laws of metaphor. So for the space of a book, usually 3 books, fantasies naturally occur in trilogies. For that space, you're freed from the restrictions of our world, and one of these restrictions is the duty of accurate reporting. This is another reason why fantasy is a good place to work things out. It provides a place of psychological safety for the creator. I read a book review recently which described the book very pithily as afraid of Twitter. If you've read fiction written in the last few years, you probably know what that means. And I want to be clear, right? I'm a supporter of DEI policies, political correctness, wokeness in general. I'm very much in favor of the drive and interest in hearing from voices that haven't been given as much airtime historically. So this isn't a rant about cancel culture. But it's fair to say that there's often not much space in modern discourse, particularly on social media, to get things wrong. There's not a lot of space for healthy debate or the discussion of nuance. And this often frustrates me because the thing my natural allies often seem to forget is that diversity means difference. Difference means people are sometimes going to disagree in quite substantive ways on serious topics. And art that's made in the spirit of, I don't want to get anything wrong, I don't want to get criticized on social media, is not good art. That fear is incredibly damaging to curiosity and exploration and play, which are all necessary conditions for the creation of good art. And I find fantasy can be useful here. So for an artist, for a thinker, it's a way to introduce some distance from reality. And that can provide cover for ideas and thoughts and feelings that otherwise not only other people might find challenging, but that you yourself might be a bit too scared to acknowledge, much less put on the page. Fantasy is the natural language of the subconscious. It's the place where the part of you maybe don't know about, don't fully understand, can come out into the light. And there's another way in which fantasy can provide a safe space for creative and intellectual exploration. I mentioned earlier the duty of accurate reporting. Now, you might say, well, a fiction writer isn't a journalist. Nobody expects novelists to report the facts or to be comprehensive or fair. You don't need fantasy to exercise poetic license. And that's true, but equally, fantasy does give you permission. It gives you the freedom to be inaccurate. And that freedom can be especially valuable for some of us. So what I mean by this, okay? I'm probably the first Malaysian who's won the Hugo Award, although, to be fair, I haven't fact-checked this. That's probably true of all the awards I've won and been shortlisted for. I promise this is relevant, and I'm not just bragging. But what that means is I'm often in spaces where I'm treated as a representative of my particular background and community. And that's nice in a lot of ways, right? It's nice to have a voice. Growing up, I was not aware of any writers like me. I didn't know of any writers who spoke the kind of English and other languages my friends and family spoke, who lived in the kind of places we lived. But being a representative is also a burden, right? I'm not the only one. There are quite a few of us Chinese Malaysian writers working in fantasy now. Definitely more than 5, so we're doing well. it's not a huge number, okay? And being one of the only ones, that means that for many people, your work will be the only channel through which they see people like you. For many people like you, your work is one of the very few channels through which they get to see themselves. So you better get it right. Not a helpful mindset in which to approach writing a story, in case you were wondering. I definitely need to get an A in cultural representation, a thing that is normal to want and possible to achieve. That's not what I'm here to do. I have reservations about how representation is talked about. Greater diversity in characters, in people depicted on book covers, creators, publishing professionals. I'm a big fan, right? All in favor of that. But representation means something that stands for another, an image, a symbol, a sign. That's about the external. That only goes so far. I'm interested in the insides of things, right? I'm much more interested in perspective than representation as such. So going back to that C.S. Lewis quote, it's about what you see and hear, where you're standing, your perspective, how you see things. Then I start to understand better what sort of person you are. So I don't know whether it's perverse that my Tolkien lecture seems to have structured itself around a Narnia reference. We'll call that a deep cut, okay? Let's go with it. Because the Pevensies return from Narnia, ruling Narnia to childhood in our world, is also a great example of another use of fantasy I wanted to talk about, and that's the freedom to time travel. I'm going to talk about The Lord of the Rings now. I'm just going to take a moment first to establish my cred. I used to read The Lord of the Rings once every year. I was a member of an online community called the LOTR Fangirls. Yes, I was 15 years old. And I once beat Christopher Paolini, author of Eragon, in a Lord of the Rings trivia quiz. Thank you. We were actually beaten by a fan in the audience. However, I felt beating Christopher was a pretty good for me. And it was a really spooky experience, actually. It was multiple choice questions. And, I went into this fugue state where I was hitting the answers, thinking to myself, wow, I didn't know I knew the name of the great-grandfather of Gandalf's horse. So those are my qualifications for giving this lecture. But The Lord of the Rings is a great example of how fantasy lets you time travel as a writer, by which I mean you get to compress time periods, pick and choose from history, hop between aesthetics. You can basically have as many genres as you want all in the same book. So in The Lord of the Rings, you got the Rohirrim, who are Anglo-Saxons on horses, next to the elves, who are from some sort of Finnish saga, next to the hobbits, who are Edwardians in William Morris waistcoats. But what I personally like about the juxtaposition of very different eras of history and very different registers is that it gives enormous potential for jokes. Tolkien makes the most of that, but he also makes the most of the scope it gives him for drama, right? And it all works. One moment, Legolas is singing a song about a sexy waterfall. The next moment, Gandalf's lighting up a joint with Pippin and Merry. And then there's an epic battle between the forces of good and evil. Tolkien pulls back. You're seeing all of Middle-earth racked in this terrible war. And then he zooms in and you're with Sam Gamgee cooking rabbits amidst disaster. The epic and the intimate are woven together. And the grandeur is more affecting. The mundane is made more poignant by the contrast. And you see this flexibility of fantasy, this freedom not only of speech, but in how you speak being published today. What other genre allows you to engage in high melodrama, but also have your characters speak in memes? Tolkien was a practitioner, not the meme part, but he was a practitioner of a tradition now being continued by writers like Tamsin Muir, author of the Locked Tomb books. If you guys haven't read that, that's kind of like a mix of Gormenghast and Tumblr. And Sarah Rhys Brennan, whose recent English language isekai, Long Live Evil, came out recently. So you've got, in these books and books like them, mannered prose and rhyming prophecies mixed with jokes and references from Tumblr. The deliberate anachronisms may not work for everyone, but they do work for many readers. And, for a writer, this ability to time travel, to speak in many tongues, grants access to a generous toolbox, not necessarily available in other genres. The freedom of how to speak matters to me personally because I'm interested in sentences, which is not surprising, right? The sequence of words matters to me. I'm a writer and I'm a lawyer. In both professions, sentences matter a lot. But I also mean sentence in the sense in which Virginia Woolf uses it. So in A Room of One's Own, she talks of the difficulties early female novelists faced in expressing themselves. And she says they had no tradition behind them, or one so short and partial that it was of little help. Perhaps the first thing a woman novelist would find, setting pen to paper, was that there was no common sentence ready for her use. Now, you can take issue with aspects of the passage in which Woolf makes this argument, but it's always stuck with me because I recognized the difficulty she described. And this was another of these moments of recognition, right? Oh, I knew that, but I didn't know I knew it, and I didn't know anyone else knew it. It's hard to be a writer or want to be a writer and find you have no common sentence ready for your use because all the sentences you've previously read or been exposed to are from traditions of literature that historically have had no space for you, traditions in which you're invisible, in which you had no voice. So the challenge for writers like me is that you have to design your own sentence, proper for your own use, as Woolf puts it. She says Jane Austen succeeded in doing that, but most of us are not Jane Austen. And for those of us non-geniuses out there, I would argue that the freedom and flexibility of fantasy is a huge boon because it opens up a multiplicity of voices and styles and time periods to draw upon. You can travel through time and space to find the sentences you need. I would like to talk about one last use of fantasy, which can also be described as a freedom, and that is the freedom to be insignificant. I was talking earlier about the burden of being a representative. There is a burden to being perceived as the diversity hire. Not only the obvious, that it implies your work is being published or read not for its literary value, or indeed because it's entertaining, but as a box-ticking exercise, right? I've supported the cause of diversity today, well done me. There's also a fair amount of pressure on artists like me to be important, to deal with serious issues in your work. It's very common that people will apply the lens of advocacy for a cause to your fiction. So I was asked relatively recently in an interview about the main character of my first novel, Sorcerer to the Crown. Zacharias Wythe is England's first sorcerer royal of African heritage, and he's just kind of a nice guy, you know? He believes in women's rights, he's in a position of some power, but he's careful about using his power, but he's maybe not that comfortable with it. And the interviewer said, you know, this is a very unconventional type of male character in fantasy. Why did you choose to write about someone like that? And my answer was, because I think he's hot. That's what I find attractive in a man. Listen, if I'm going to be hallucinating vividly about a character for months, they better be sexy. So what I would say about importance is I would much rather be interesting than important, right? To be told implicitly or indeed explicitly that my gender or race or sexuality or the gender or race or sexuality of my characters is the most interesting thing about my work is as imprisoning in a way as the erasure of those aspects of my identity in my work. So the flip side of fantasy not being taken seriously in some circles is that it doesn't have to be that serious. There's a shared understanding between practitioners of this genre, whether that's writers, readers, reviewers, publishers, that is fun. You know, I do get asked a lot, why write fantasy? So the honest answer is, I don't know, just kind of happened. But for those of us who write and read it, you know, you don't have to ask, it's obvious. Why put a dragon in a book? Why wouldn't you? Dragons are cool. Why include magic? Because it's magical. So fantasy is freeing in that sense, right? The fact it's dismissed, it's perceived by some as trivial or childish, can be very convenient. So I did conceive of this talk as a talk about uses of fantasy, and you'll have noticed that I've actually been using the word freedom a lot. I had to write the whole thing before I realized it's a lecture about the freedoms fantasy gives us, and these freedoms all add up to one big freedom, which is artistic freedom, creative freedom. In many ways, the world we live in now doesn't reward being a human being. I was talking recently with some friends about generative AI, as indeed we are all talking about generative AI, what this technology might mean for our society, how we work and how we relate to each other. I did have a friend ask me if I wrote my speech using ChatGPT. For the record, I didn't. And I think my answer would be ChatGPT doesn't know what I want to say. And then, you could say, well, you could tell ChatGPT what you wanted to say. And in that case, why wouldn't I simply say what I want to say? And I don't find out until I've written it, right? But by writing, I find out what it was I want to say. Besides the environmental impact and the infringement of intellectual property rights on which generative AI is founded, one of the things about AI that most troubles me at the moment is how it's being used as a shortcut for living. To use AI to cut through busy work or tackle the sorting and analysis of data at scale, no problem with that, sensible use cases. But it's being used for things we shouldn't be surrendering to the machine. So I was very troubled. I read an article that said the top use case for AI in 2025 was therapy or companionship. And people are using ChatGPT to draft messages to people they meet on dating apps, right? And the only way I can wrap my head around this is to say to myself, people are overwhelmed by the effort of living in this world. And you can't blame them, in a way. But I think in a world that seems so deliberately designed against human flourishing, art takes on an increased importance. And I don't say this in a self-serving way. Art's important, buy my books. I mean that art is one way to be a person. Expressing yourself, creating, engaging with the creative work of others is something everyone can do. It's fundamentally democratic. And it's something that's deeply human. It enables connection. It's part of what makes life living. And you need artistic freedom to be able to do that fully. So that's my argument for fantasy literature, that it yields these freedoms to think, to play, to be curious, to explore, to be human. And that's something we need more than ever at this moment in time. So I did end up making a utilitarian defense of fantasy after all, despite my best intentions. Thank you.
Hello? Hello? So thank you so much, Zen, for such a fascinating lecture. It's really been a pleasure to have you speak at Pembroke. We have a bit of time now for a Q&A, if you're happy to pick questions. So if you want to pop your hand up, and we'll have a glamorous assistant come around and ask questions.
Hi, first of all, I thought it was an amazing talk, really interesting.
Thank you.
But my question is to do with kind of the future of fantasy within maybe the English canon, which is obviously debated a lot. Should there be a canon? But do you see fantasy as kind of in the next 20, 30 years having a place taught alongside things like Jane Austen? Obviously, we have a lecture series about fantasy here, but it's not really taught by tutors. Where do you see it kind of coming in to the canon?
Yeah, I mean, Oxford's a bit of a stick in the mud, isn't it? I mean, no offense, guys, but I studied at Cambridge myself, which I do include in that. But fantasy is being read and taught and researched, in many kind of academic spaces across the country and across the world. I had the pleasure of signing an essay on a short story I wrote last year. I'm pleased to say she got an A, so that was nice. But yeah, so I think as with any other form of literature, it's being studied, and I think it has its place next to kind of all the other more genteel types of literature.
Likewise, thank you for such a fascinating talk. I really loved what you said about writing as a form of thinking, where you sort of said you had to sort of write out this speech in order to kind of determine what it was that you were getting at. I was wondering, in terms of your own writing, where has that sort of cropped in? Is there a certain book or a sort of character where you think, I was entering into it thinking that it was going to be a certain way, but then through the process of writing it completely shifted through that same process of just writing it out and realising that it was going organically a different way?
I think every novelist will say that probably happens with almost every novel, because the book shifts as you're writing it. But so I would say in every book, I've written it to work out what I was thinking or feeling about something. Because as a writer, you often get like, why did you write this book? And then the answer is like, I don't really know. But you have to come up with some kind of answer, right? And so I've actually worked out there are certain common themes. And what I say to people is usually with almost every novel I've written, there's two components. Usually there's some kind of odd couple, some dynamic I enjoy exploring. So in Blackwater Sister, for example, it was a young woman and then her dead grandma who's living in her head as a very censorious ghost. And then there's an aspect of the world that feels very personal that I don't fully understand. So in Blackwater Sister, again, this was the practice of spirit mediumship, which is a kind of practice of Chinese folk religion that I kind of grew up around, but didn't feel that close to, but also felt quite close in some ways. So I wanted to explore that through the book. And there's those two things. And I think writing to me is really useful way, writing fiction particularly, is a useful way of making myself look at something for a period of time and then seeing what kind of comes out of that.
Thank you. Was it hard to publish your first book? How long did it take for the publisher to publish it?
Was it hard to publish my first book? No. I would say the publishing process is a lot easier than the writing process. The publishing part is almost the easy part, as long as you don't have any feelings. But if you can remove yourself from ego and practice a kind of Buddhist detachment from outcome, publishing is not that difficult. With writing, it's hard. So it took me a couple of tries to write a novel. I wrote 2 novels that were really, really bad. And then I wrote a third novel, which was eventually going to be Sorcerer to the Crown, my debut novel. And I thought, okay, this one I can send to people without, without shame. And I managed to get an agent I got my first offer of representation within 2 weeks after I sent out the book, which is very fast. I then spent a year revising the book with my agent, which is what I mean by the writing part is really hard. That was really hard work. And then once that was done, and she said it's ready, let's send it to publishers, I got an offer to publish around 6 weeks after the book had been sent out, which again, by publishing standards, is very fast. So the writing and thinking is the hard part, I think. The publishing is kind of whatever.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. And I have a very, basic question. How do you usually write a novel? And how do you kind of sustain your passion throughout the long process of, like you said, writing and revising the story?
In all seriousness, making sure the characters are sexy to you is very helpful. It is actually very helpful. They don't have to be, sexy in an actually sexual way. They could just be interesting to you, right? But I think something of that kind of obsessiveness of focus is very helpful. If you're like, I just really want to make, sense of how this character ticks. And then apart from that, making sure it's something that you really, you don't fully understand. It can be quite helpful as well if you kind of set it in a world where you need to kind of work something out. And then apart from that, it's just training in a way that so I started in short fiction, not because, I have to confess, because I was so kind of, it wasn't a kind of deliberate choice, it was just because I couldn't really write more than 5,000 words at a time. But I knew I wanted to write novels eventually. So you just work your way up to it. First you're finishing, always focus on finishing stuff. That's a really important skill to develop. So first, you're working, you're like, okay, I can finish a 5,000 word short story. Right, let's push ourselves. Let's finish a 10,000 word story. And then you kind of, now I'm going to do a 20,000, 30,000 word novella. Eventually, you're going to work your way up to writing, the 80 to 100,000 words of kind of consecutive narrative that you require for a novel. So in the same way that you might train for a marathon, just build up to it.
Thank you, Zen. So I've read quite a few of your books. Most recently, I just finished reading The Friend Zone Experiment, which I loved.
Thank you.
But I was interested that having made a name as a fantasy writer, and with fantasy romance being such an up-and-coming genre, you'd actually written a non-fantasy romance. And I just, wondered whether you could tell us a bit about why you chose to do that and what the differences are in writing a straight romance compared to a fantasy novel.
So what I should be clear about in terms of my writing career decisions is that they don't make any sense. That there's no kind of commercial judgment that enters into this, as my agent knows to her sorrow. So what happened with the Friend Zone Experiment was I was writing fantasy and I was very happy in this route, and I was like, every idea I've got is fantasy, and this is great, this is the best genre, etc., etc. It gives me all this freedom. And then COVID happened, and we were in lockdown. And then what happened while we were in lockdown is I got into K-dramas. And I just got really into the kind of mix of kind of romance and there are fantasy K-dramas, to be clear, but the ones that I got really obsessed with just happened not to be fantasy. And I thought, I'll write a K-drama, haha. Not the smartest decision. But so that's kind of what happened. I just thought, I'll have a go. So it would have indeed have been sensible to say, to be like, well, actually, I'll write a fantasy romance and get a massive deal. But I don't make creative decisions that way. I guess the difference is, I think romantasy is very much its own thing. It is, to me, I think it's kind of the outgrowth of YA fantasy. The YA readers are old enough now and they want some sex scenes in their fast-paced fantasy worlds, right? So that's kind of I almost view it as its own thing. I think some of the differences are that it requires a lot less research writing romance set in the current, modern day world. My romances are contemporary romances set in London, and I lived in London for 9 years, so it required a lot less research. I think it's really interesting because romances have a very formulaic plot, and I don't mean this in a bad way at all, but in the same way that if you're writing a sonnet, you've got to follow certain rules. When you're writing a romance, you've got to follow certain rules. And I think that's actually, it was quite interesting to do, like an interesting technical challenge because you need to prevent the couple from getting together, but they have to get together at the end. And so you can't prevent them by all the usual, you can think of it, if you're thinking, right, what would keep two people apart in the modern day, right? There's so few kind of like barriers to them getting together compared to in Jane Austen's time, where a woman couldn't approach a man, for example. And then you start thinking about all the personality dysfunctions amongst the people of your acquaintance. You can't put that in a romance novel because the readers will be turned off. They'll be like, I don't root for them anymore. They should get a divorce. Just like you are thinking about your friend, she needs to get a divorce, So it's a very interesting technical challenge. You have to be like, I'll keep them apart, but like they still need to be attractive. I still need to root for them. So yeah, I thought it was an interesting exploration.
Yeah, speaking of technical challenges, how do you tackle characters who are very different from you? How do you think into characters that are unlike you?
Have I written many characters that are unlike me? I suppose I start from the viewpoint that they can't be that different. Like, I think if I was writing the kind of science fiction where the point is that it is a very different type of intelligence or form of life, obviously you might take a different approach to tackling it. Because I've only written humans as main characters so far, well, actually, with the occasional exception of like the dragon and so on. But usually my dragons are millennials, right? They just like happen to have tails and stuff. So I think I start from like, they can't be that different. And maybe because I grew up reading, these like Penguin popular classics about like, kind of white people who like, rode in horse carriages and used handkerchiefs and like spoke very different English. Like, that was so out of my experience. They might have been aliens. But even so, reading the book, I was like, yeah, I kind of recognize some of this. Like, I recognize some of these social dynamics and like some of these emotions and so on. So I guess that's where I start from. And then also like I do a bunch of research as well, of course. But yeah, I think I was lucky actually to start writing in an era when perhaps it was a bit less of a dicey proposition writing someone of a different background from you.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering what your research process was like and if you had a favorite part of the writing process.
I think my favorite part of the writing process is when you kind of like, it's like when you're writing, say, with a fountain pen, and at first it's a bit like sticky, and then after a while the ink starts to flow. And I find when you're writing that can happen intellectually, but you start, you're kind of like, I'm not really, you're kind of like, you're not in it yet, and then you get into the flow of it, and then it's going great, and then suddenly it's like, it's all coming. That is my favorite part. The research process is really different depending on what kind of book it is. So at the moment, I'm reading a book about Chinese history because I'm going back to fantasy. I'm working on a historical fantasy at the moment, and I just tend to read lots of different things, kind of vaguely connected to the world and the plot and the thing I've got in mind. But for the Friend Zone experiment, which was mentioned earlier, which is a contemporary romance set in London, one of the things I did, so it's a romance, but like the plot relates to corporate wrongdoing. So one of the pieces of research I did was I said to myself, oh yeah, I wonder what happened to the dad of my rich friend who got done for corporate fraud 10 years ago. And I looked him up, and this is really interesting, right, because I hadn't thought about this in 10 years, and I hadn't actually seen that much of the friend in the intervening period. I looked him up, and it turned out that he was actually wanted by the Securities Commission of Malaysia. He'd received a fine in court because these things take a long time, and he had absented himself from the country. And interestingly, I was going to his house in Singapore to see his daughter in 2 weeks' time. So that was a really interesting visit where I was like, do I ask? If he comes out, am I gonna be like, oh, hi, uncle. Guess I have to email the Securities Commission now. Anyway, he didn't make an appearance, and he did show up and pay his fine eventually. So the research process differs for each book.
Hello. You talked a little bit about the raging sort of internet debate about appropriate representation, and it sounded a little bit like you thought maybe that conversation was unsatisfying or misguided, and I wondered if you could talk about what you find missing from that conversation or what you think would be good to discuss in that context.
The conversation about representation?
Yes, exactly.
I think it's just really facile sometimes. Like, I think it's very, but as, it's almost any conversation in social media is like that. But I do think it's very surface. It's about the surface of things. Like, this person is Chinese, so she's allowed to write Chinese people. This person is queer, so he's allowed to write queer people, right? And we've seen. I mean, some people have seen this multiple times where somebody is like, oh, well, they're not allowed to write queer people, for example, because they're not queer. And then like the author, after, a social media firestorm is like, well, I'm coming out of the closet, thanks, guys. Which is not an ideal outcome, I would say. So I think I do find that very frustrating. And I think, it's often driven by good intentions, but it can become a kind of like, kind of like a moral purity test type thing, which I think is not what literature should be about, really. I think books should tackle things that are kind of, maybe kind of morally dubious. Maybe you don't really know what you think or feel about it. And actually the point of writing a book or reading a book about it is to kind of work out how you might feel about it, or, put these characters in a situation. It's like, actually, is this person has done something terrible or whatever, or problematic, sympathetic, or do they have a point, And so I think, Yeah, so that's a bit of ramble, sorry, but basically, I do think it's very fascinating. I think it leads to certain things like we all know about the, like, you have a diverse cast of characters, but only the, like, you can actually tell. So actually, I read a recent review of a book that identified this issue, right? Which is like, it's by a writer who's known to be progressive, right? And it's like a mystery. And the reviewer said, given everything I know about this book, it's a mystery, but we know the queer character's not going to be the baddie, the woman's not going to be the baddie, the black guy's not going to be the baddie, it'll be the straight white man. So it's like, that affects your experience of a book, right? You're like, if you know that's coming because it's so morally determined from the outset, that's not, I think, that's not really the full rich experience of literature you should be having. So it doesn't reflect what people are like, which is complex no matter kind of what background they've got. Even marginalized people can be bad, and and it's actually quite flattening to only portray people from marginalized backgrounds as kind of virtuous and pure. So yeah, that's how I feel.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was curious, I've come across this sentiment that fantasy literature as a genre sort of springs out of this like Western European tradition of like it draws on Western European mythologies and such. And I was just curious, like, especially as a Malaysian writer, how do you feel do you feel at all that has affected your career or like the way your work is received, or if you just think the genre has completely shifted away from that view and it's like that's now just outdated?
I think, I've been lucky. I don't think I've ever felt that my books weren't being published because, I was drawing on like foreign mythologies or whatever. There are times I've written books and been like, I don't think the Westerners are quite getting it. And that's why that has affected its reception. But like, it's a bit more complex than like, for me in my generation, it's been a bit more complex than like the editor saying, oh, we've already got an Asian book, so we don't need another Asian book, thank you very much. Which previous generations of authors did experience. I think, if anything, I think it's no longer the case that fantasy, in English, only draws on kind of Western mythology. I mean, there are plenty of, there are some examples. I guess we should say plenty of examples. But I do also see a kind of flip side, which is that I do see often people from non-Western backgrounds feeling like they're obliged to write a certain kind of thing, or there's a very particular kind of lens that's placed in the work. So Blackwater Sister, I found it really funny. It's set in like 21st century Penang, and it's about spirit mediumship, as I said, and basically it's about these kind of gods coming and possessing the mediums. And there are kind of two things about the Blackwater Sister I think are interesting. Firstly, it's shelved as fantasy and marketed as fantasy because it writes about this practice as though things that people believe are happening are true. So it's you could go to Malaysia or Singapore now and go to a temple and watch a spirit medium, right, at work. They're actually on YouTube. Okay, so you can actually watch spirit medium performances and possessions on YouTube, which my Asian friends are horrified by. When I watched this for research, they were like, weren't you afraid that you would get possessed because you were watching these? And I was like, well, I wasn't before. Now I am. Thank you. But so this is a very modern belief. So the interesting thing about Blackwater Sister when it got marketed, in the UK, it was like a book drawing on, set in modern Malaysia, but drawing on ancient Asian mythology. I was like, this is about stuff that is happening in the 21st century. Like, I get where they're coming from, but it's actually not ancient Asian mythology. It's modern religious practice. So yeah. So I guess I think there can be quite a flattening lens, and I definitely know people who feel like they've got to write the Chinese thing just because they're Chinese, right? And actually, they want to write elves or something, and maybe they feel like they're not kind of allowed to write elves, right?
I think we've got one more question.
Hi Zen. So you started out this lecture by saying you're a lawyer in addition to a writer. And I don't know a lot about law, but it seems like it's something that's quite routine, requires you to like stick to reality and like facts. How do you kind of cultivate that space for joy and for fantasy in your day-to-day? And also, I'm kind of curious, like how your schedule actually looks like. Like, is it like a 9 to 5 you do your law job, and then like 6 to 10 you do writing, and how does it look like? Yeah.
You're all gonna really regret now I take you through my Outlook diary. I work 3 days a week as a government lawyer, so there's a proper 9 to 5, guys, okay? And then I have 2 days in theory where I get to write. I also have 2 small children, so, lots of free time here. I'm not publishing a book a year, let's put it that way. I think in terms of law versus fantasy, like, I don't know that it is, okay, I guess I don't really see an inconsistency, because I think if you do too much of one thing, you can get a bit sick of it. So I do actually know people who've got creative day jobs, and actually, because they're using the creative bit of themselves, by the time they get home and they want to write their novel, they don't have the juice for that anymore. And the advantage of a law job is that does not happen, right? And actually, funnily, I would say that I talked earlier about like making that leap from shorter fiction to novel writing and building up that stamina. And one of the things that actually helped me get my head around writing a novel-length work was, interestingly, at work, watching a senior associate, I was a trainee solicitor at the time, watching a trainee senior associate draft an 86,000-word witness statement. And that's a huge piece of work, right? It took months and months, because the thing is, with a witness statement, I mean, we can make jokes about it, but you can't actually make stuff up. You're not allowed to invent things. So it was 25 lever arch files worth of exhibits to evidence everything that was being said in the witness statement. But it was a narrative. Witness statement is the story to the court. This is what happened, right? And so that actually, in a funny way, kind of made me think, oh, I can write a novel, because I can see how you write the witness statement. I could write a novel.
All right, please join me in giving a very big thank you to Zen Cho for delivering this year's Tolkien Lecture. And as a small token of appreciation, we'd like to present to you a Pembroke College mug and a Lord of the Rings tote bag.
I get merchandise!
Thank you so much again, Zen Cho.
Actually, don't tell anyone this, but I went to Pembroke, Cambridge, and I did actually steal a coffee cup from like my last formal there, so they'll join my coffee cup. Thank you.
So now you have one from Pembroke, Oxford.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.